It's time to check your money with America's money maven, Vicki Brackens. Vicki Brackens is the president of Brackens Financial Solutions Network, LLC, and a registered representative of LPL Financial, member SIPC. Vicki, we have a special guest in the building.
Well, George, it's becoming what I would call an incredibly important habit for us to have Assemblymember Pamela J. Hunter, who's with the Assembly District 128 here in New York, as our guest. I'm going to start making this maybe like a every 6-month kind of visit for her, because to hear from her and exactly what's going on within the state legislature, particularly in the area of banking and insurance, gives us a good overview of what we can expect and how we should react to some of the economic changes that are happening. But for those of you who are not familiar with Assemblymember Pamela J. Hunter, she is the chair of the New York State Banking Committee for the New York State Assembly. She is from upstate New York, served in the U.S. Army, honorably discharged with Commendation Medal and 2 Achievement Medals. She has professional certifications in human resources, and her district includes the near west and eastern portion of the city of Syracuse and the surrounding town of DeWitt, Onondaga, and Salina. Prior to her election to the New York State Assembly in 2015, Assemblymember Hunter served as the Syracuse Community Council on the Syracuse Community Council for 3 years and chaired the Public Safety Committee. Well, thank you again, for joining us.
Well, I got one more thing to say about that. One more thing.
What's that?
She's my assembly person.
Oh, that's right. I forgot to say that again. Go ahead, George. She is George Kilpatrick's assembly person.
Yes.
Now
yes.
we can move
We
ahead.
good now.
Okay. All right. It's been a really busy year for you and for the committee. I would imagine so, because we've lived through 4 interest rate hikes in 2023, going from 4.5% to 5.25. In fact, today the Federal Reserve announced that they were not going to, at least at this segment, raise interest rates. But what I have to ask you, first of all, is when rates go up or change, does the Federal Reserve send out a notice to the banking committee and the banking community on what they're getting ready to do?
They may send it to the regulators,
Okay.
but I am a legislator, so they're definitely not sending that information to me. But based on the conversation I have and continual conversations I have with our regulator, which is the superintendent at the Department for Financial Services, I was aware that they probably would not be hiking, at least now, and some other issues obviously affecting the banking area. So we keep in close contact, and my staff, really monitors what's going on in that banking sphere, because as legislators, we don't always get the information directly from the feds, and our oversight is state chartered banks, but obviously it encompasses everything that has to do with money, and that affects my constituents. So we want to make sure that we're well educated about what's going on.
Okay, well, listen, I wanted to ask, it was a little bit of a trick question, but when you were with us before, you explained the difference between state chartered banks and national banks. And so I wanted to be sure that we touched a little bit on that subject again. So if you wouldn't mind, could you do that once again?
Yes. So as far as oversight is concerned, you're looking at federally chartered banks. That would be your big banks like JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, state chartered banks, and state chartered banks actually can be federally chartered if they want to, but state chartered banks would be like your local community banks in the Syracuse area, or in the capital region. It could be like NBT Bank, Pathfinder Bank, Community Bank, mid-sized banks. And those banks really are the foundation for lending in our communities. If you're talking about small businesses, if you're talking about home loans that aren't provided mortgages like online, like Rocket Money or Quicken and places like that, they're places where people do personal banking, small personal loans. Those are kind of the foundation for developments in our community. And state charter banks have oversight and regulation by New York State. Federally chartered banks basically can do what they want without oversight from the state government, and they have oversight, obviously, from the federal government. But there is regulation, FDIC, and other governmental agencies that do provide guidance that all banks obviously have to abide by.
So touching a little bit on that statement that you made concerning state chartered banks having regulations that are driven by the state charters, when interest rates go up, do you have, or does the Banking Commission have any say in how much the bank can respond to interest rates going up?
No, no. And they could respond not by way of saying those rates are instituted, but what they could do, and this is some of the conversation what we're having today, especially with commercial lending, is saying, you know, we want to work with you. We want to be able to find a way to make sure that your loan doesn't get into default. So maybe we're going to extend the loan in a different way. We're going to, you know, work within, you know, parameters in a different way to make sure that the businesses, you know, stay, you know, solvent. I guess that in some ways, they're the first line of defense, these banks, to make sure that our businesses remain solvent, don't go, you know, into default. So even if interest rates go up, they could, you know, help commercial loans or people who have loans to say, let's like rework, you know, the loan. The concern, especially with raised interest rates and inflation, and this is what we're talking about now, is, and what may happen with the feds if they raise the reserves and asking banks to have increased capital reserves, is if that happens and the reserves increase for the banks, that might decrease lending. If banks decrease lending, that means you and I are not going to be able to go to the banks and get the money that we need for the mortgages. Maybe examiners would say we're of good risk now, but later maybe not of good risk. So those are things that we have to monitor because we need money circulating in our communities.
Okay, so now you touched on so many things there, trying to pull a few things back. It was incredible to really hear how intertwined these decisions are. So that, because we talk about this all the time, the fact that these decisions are intertwined, it's not just standalone operation. So if interest rates go up and the reserve required to keep banks solvent also goes up, then the amount of money, you're saying that the amount of money that's available for lending in a community, which is driven primarily by community banks, by banks under the state charter, will decrease. And that decrease could cause there to be less money available for business operations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Correct?
Yes.
And
Yes, that could happen. That doesn't mean it's necessarily going to happen.
Okay.
But it could happen. And this is just talking about liquidity, making sure that banks have enough actual money, cash money that they have in reserves. And that means if they have to keep it, they can't lend it because they have to keep it locked away in the bank per statute.
Okay. George, you were about to ask a question?
My question was going to be whether or not that meant that if for the money that is available, would we have to pay more for it?
Potentially, yeah.
Potentially. Okay. Okay. Absolutely. Now, this relationship between reserve and how much is available to lend, is it a dollar to dollar relationship?
It may not be. If we were talking about cryptocurrency, then it would have to be actual dollar to dollar, but that is not generally the case relative to reserves. I think it goes by risk. They look at different factors, what the debt ratio portfolios that different banks carry, you know, how do they, what their portfolio looks like, how many home loans do they have, how many commercial loans do they have, how many personal loans do they have, to make sure that that ratio looks correct.
Okay, so the key word though is ratio. So it really is not, we have to have in the bank vault, and I know this is not the case that they keep all the money in the vault, but that's the conception that we have. The bank vault, we have $100 million, so we can only lend $100 million. It could be $300 million X based on the type of lending that's necessary. Well,
correct. And they normally lend more than actually the amount of actual cash that they have. That's how it works.
Exactly. Okay. There is a absolute ratio, and it's never just the cash that they have. So now you mentioned, and we'll come back to that magic word that you said, cryptocurrency, a little bit later. But also one of the things that I'm sure has kept you busy over the last year or last several months has been the fact that we had 4 bank failures this year, big ones. 3 of them domiciled primarily in California, but the 4th was here in New York State, Signature Bank. Now, with Signature Bank's failure, once that happened, how does your committee get involved? Or was there anything before that happened that you knew about or that you were involved in as far as the Banking Commission or the state of New York?
Yeah, so similar to what happened with Silicon Valley, I was actually in California when that happened. I think we talked about that when we last spoke. But similar to, and all of this happened, pretty much around the same period of time with Signature. While it was happening, my office, me personally, was having ongoing conversations with the Department of Financial Services, the governor's office. What does this look like? Does there need to be legislation? Are consumers protected? We had people calling the office saying, is my cash safe? Is it okay to keep my money in the bank? And that was one of the biggest concerns, to make sure that people remain calm and that the information was very clear, because banks didn't want to have bank runs where people run to the bank and literally take out all their cash from the bank. And that was with some of the issues that they had in California, is that they didn't have the liquidity. They didn't have the money in the bank to cover all of the people who wanted to take their money out.
So beyond actually what happens as far as the reaction and the immediate aftermath, say 24, 36 hours or so, is there anything else that your department gets involved in or had to get involved in concerning backstopping or keeping the banking system running smoothly in the state of New York?
There's nothing legislatively that we needed to do, but we worked very consistently with the department. We had several elected leader conversations with the department, so people were aware of what was going on, what the department was doing with the federal government to make sure people's deposits were protected, and if there needed to be anything that we needed to do, and to look at what was happening, because maybe there needs to be safeguards and potential legislation in the future to make sure things like this don't happen again. I think the department's done a very good job in trying to especially work with the feds. They put together strong, at least on the cryptocurrency side, strong regulation to protect consumers. And I think relative to some of these bank failures, working with the examiners to make sure they have appropriate reserves, looking at the mix of their debt credit ratio, what kind of risk are they taking, and a lot of the risk was relative to cryptocurrency, and that proved to be not wise as far as their debt ratio mix.
Okay. Well, I'm gonna make my big disclaimer, which I always have to say in this next subject that we're going to talk about. This next subject that we're going to touch on is not an indication of an investment or investment advice, but I do want to be sure that we actually talk about your most recent committee investigation and testimony that came through concerning the cryptocurrency industry. And I believe in May, you had the industry come in and the banking industry come in to talk about transparency and the understanding concerning the cryptocurrency industry. What did you learn from that investigation?
We have a lot of work to do. We have a lot of work to do. If you recall, when cryptocurrency first started, this was something that people put together that was supposed to be outside regulation, that it was supposed to be a way for me and you to share money without the whole regulatory process of money. Well, That's not happening now. And what we want to make sure is that there are safeguards. New York has some of the strongest cryptocurrency regulation in the country. And that's important because if you see companies like FTX, where they were selling a bag of goods and they didn't have the money to back it up, lots of people lost a lot of money. Well, a lot of people in New York didn't lose a lot of money because it was never licensed in New York. And so that's why we have protections that you can only buy in New York what's licensed in New York. And there are safeguards if you go on a VPN, if you are trying to buy crypto and you live in New York for companies that aren't licensed. They're always examining, they're on the blockchain, they're looking online,
What's a
monitoring
VPN? What's a
outside.
VPN?
The encrypted internet, essentially, where you
okay.
can go online to, instead of just, I'm on Google and let me just look up a way for you to be able to kind of bypass like kind of like a, not dark web, but a different kind of internet encryption way to be online. And they're able to, and people have these in their homes, and they have ways to bypass the mainstream way that people utilize the internet. And we want to make sure that if you're in New York and you're doing that, you're protected, especially if you're trying to buy crypto from an unlicensed virtual currency provider.
Okay. So when we get to the issue of you said we have a lot to do, a lot of work to do. What stage are we in? If you can kind of explain, if you had to say like we're mid-range of something happening, or have we decided in New York that it's always going to remain an unlicensed? Where are we in the thinking?
Well, some of the problem is we're right in it. You know, the superintendent and the folks at DFS, you know, I have, like I said, we have some of the strongest regulations. But with cryptocurrency comes a lot of risk, and that comes with financial literacy for folks. You know, you can go on an app right now, Cash App and some other apps, and actually buy Bitcoin. You can buy cryptocurrency. Is that the right thing for you to do? Is it the smartest thing for you to, you know, to be doing? That it's ripe for people to lose their money if they aren't protected and they don't understand. You give away your password and somebody gets it, your money's gone. There is no way for you to get your money back once it gets stolen with crypto. This isn't like someone taking your credit card and, you know, you're only liable for $50. And so we want to make sure that money isn't being laundered. We want to make sure that they're not using this cryptocurrency for human trafficking. So a lot of things that need protections, that we have strong protections, and it's an emerging market. It's an emerging business in New York. There are not a lot of crypto businesses because it takes a long time to get a license, and it's expensive. And that's some of the concerns that some of the providers have, is like, why is it taking so long for me to get a license when in other states you can easily, you know, just start doing business? And it's for consumer protection. We want to make sure that, you know, I'm not the owner and I'm trying to sell something, and then all of a sudden there's not enough money to go around and people are losing a lot of money, that there's a conflict of interest. We want to make sure that I am a company that's above board and I'm doing everything that's supposed to. And that takes time. Time means manpower, resources for people to be able to examine a company's governance, examine, you know, if a company really has all of the resources that it says that it has in order to be a viable business in New York. And you know, that takes time and it's very expensive.
Well, okay, I'm going to tip my hat to you, because I know how difficult it can be when something is popular. Okay, and there's a lot being written because we get to read news across the country. The fact that New York State is standing strong on making sure that there is full investigation and regulatory protection for consumers is extremely important, and I thank you for doing that. Here's the second subject that is very popular that we want to make sure. Yes.
But before you continue, Vicki, I want to say, and if people have been listening to the show, you explained the whole blockchain thing
2
anyway.
years ago.
Yes. So
Okay.
if they've been regular listeners to the show, you have been keeping them informed.
All right. So thank you, George. Thank you very much for reminding them. Okay. But okay, the second question on things that are popular, that I'm sure you're getting some pushback on, but I want to make sure we understand how this economic issue flows into the banking issue, and that is the legislation and dispensing of cannabis. The question is, how does the banking committee in New York State, since we now have licensed cannabis in New York State, reconcile this with federal law?
It's very difficult. And we had a hearing about this. And if you hear from the banking community, especially those banks that do not bank cannabis businesses, even though it's a legal business in the state of New York, they will tell you that they cannot do it because it's not allowed by the federal government. And they have the concern that the heavy hammer of the federal government is going to come in and, shut them down or give them a whole bunch of fines because they're banking something that is not regulated and it's a class 1 narcotic with the feds, and it's illegal at the federal government. But when you dive into that, you will find that not one bank has ever been fined by the federal government for banking cannabis, not one. And there was one bank in Florida that did receive fines, and that's because they had compliance issues, that they weren't doing the paperwork that they were supposed to be doing in the manner that they were supposed to. So there are banks in New York, a few credit unions, some banks that are banking cannabis now. And the problem with this is, and kudos to them for putting themselves out there, you need to bank this emerging business. If you listen to my hearing, you would hear stories of these cannabis providers who, because they have cannabis as a business and this is where they're getting their income, they can't get a home loan because you can't show where your income is coming from. They have large amounts of cash, where I've heard people drilling holes in the floor and in the walls of their home because they can't put it in the bank, because the banks won't take it. And the banks that do bank cannabis, the fees that they charge these farmers and cultivators and compounders and retailers are very high. And the reason that the fees are so high is because if the heavy hand of the federal government does come, they want to make sure that they have the money, to pay for these fees. But these businesses are small businesses. These are not large businesses. So you're talking about an emerging business where a lot of these people, this is a new, business, just getting off the ground, and they're paying high fees to pay for something that potentially could happen that hasn't happened. And that's why the Safe Banking Act that I know Senator Schumer is pushing, that has a lot of momentum now, does have bipartisan support, hopefully can pass in the Senate. If they deschedule this class 1, narcotic and take that away, this would just open up completely the banking industry for us to be able to easily bank cannabis in New York.
I do have a follow-up, and I'm glad you clarified that, because I was under the impression that it was all cash, so that you're giving me this idea that there are places, but it's very complicated.
It is complicated. And if they, it's easy for you to, there are some places, but it's a cash business. This is a cash business. And so there are regulations to how much cash you can deposit. And if you are depositing large sums of cash, the examiners, and that's their main job, is to make sure you are not using, depositing this cash from ill gains, from prostitution or human trafficking or drugs. And so you have to be able to reconcile every transaction. That takes a lot of time. That costs a lot of money. It's akin to someone who owns an ATM machine, let's say, and they have a large amount of cash in an ATM machine and they want to go deposit that. They run into some of the same problems. Is you're coming in making large deposits. How do we know where all of this large sums of cash are coming from?
Well, okay, the complications around this, I wanted to be sure that we clarified that it's still not reconciled with the federal government, because
Correct.
there's some confusion out there that it is,
It
and
is
that
not.
even though a bank is chartered in New York, we still have to contend with the federal regulation. So the Smart Banking or Safe Banking, Safe Banking legislation with Senator Schumer possibly will reconcile this once and for all.
Yes.
Assemblymember Hunter, before we let you go, because I've asked you a lot of questions, is there something that's on the horizon or future in banking or any of the other committees that you are a member of that you would like for everyone to know about?
Well, I do sit on the insurance committee, veterans, and energy committees as well. And so all of them take, a good chunk of time. I always like to, make sure that folks know that as an Army veteran myself, that any pieces of legislation that we're putting forward for veterans really, really impact them on a daily, basis. And I'm proud to have been able to, put forward legislation that helps veterans that have been affected by PTSD, veterans who've lost their life, and wanted to make sure that they're buried with distinction. And so some folks think that how come all of these things aren't happening right now? And, this should be on the federal government to take care and have responsibility for. But these folks live in the state of New York, not in the state of the United States. And so we want to make sure that they're really protected. So I'm always proud to be able to bring forward legislation for our veterans, and we'll continue to do whatever we can to make sure 20 veterans pretty much per day take their own life. And so there's a lot of work to be done to help folks and re-engage into civilian life. And sometimes that's very difficult, and I want to make sure that they're okay. On the insurance front, things are pretty much the same. I had a huge bill this year that I was just like so proud to be able to bring over the finish line. It was relative to biomarker testing. And if anybody knows someone who has been affected by cancer and has been diagnosed with cancer, this is not to test if you have cancer. This is after you've been diagnosed with, cancer or some other disease, that your provider could ask for biomarker testing. And this is just micro testing to find out, specifically what traits does your cancer have, to make sure that they can provide the appropriate treatment for your disease. And sometimes, that means that you don't have to have chemotherapy. You don't have to have radiation. It shouldn't be just for people who have lots of money to be able to get these tests. It's for anybody, including people who are on Medicaid, to make sure that people have a great quality of life and aren't, having these bad treatments because it's easiest to just always give chemo and radiation. Let's make sure we're giving them the treatment right that's proper for what their actual cancer is. And so breast cancer is different than somebody who has, bladder cancer, or somebody who has testicular cancer. So wanting to make sure that everyone has provided the same opportunity to get biomarker testing, and we're awaiting the governor to sign that as well. So that was, really exciting to be able to bring that forward in the
That's absolutely great.
insurance committee as well.
So the biomarker testing legislation provides funding for that to happen, or exactly what?
It mandates that the insurance companies have to pay for it.
Pay for it.
Oh, thank you. Yes. Okay. That is huge. That is absolutely huge. Okay. All right. And anything else you'd like for us to be aware of?
Well, you didn't give
just
energy.
What's that?
Energy?
Yeah,
Yes.
And energy. We have a lot of work to do, and a long way to get to where we need to go. And there's a lot of concerns. We're talking about all electric. We're talking about renewable energy. That we're putting a lot of money into transition. And this is big. This is very, very big. And in places like where we live in Syracuse, where a lot of the homes are older, there's a lot of concerns that, people can't afford $40,000, $50,000 to retrofit their house for geothermal and for all electric. And that's a concern. And so we want to make sure we get it right. We want to make sure that we are absolutely being cognizant of what's going on with climate, that climate change is real, that we want to make sure that we're being energy efficient, using all renewable resources to the extent that we can. And that takes infrastructure, and infrastructure takes a lot of money. But we need to make sure that we get it right and we aren't displacing homeowners and people who can't afford it for infrastructure of the future. We just need to make sure that we're getting it right.
Well, before we sign off today, I want to make sure that we encourage everyone to like and subscribe and share. Like, subscribe, and share this segment because it's packed with tremendous amounts of information that I'm sure, will clear, based on what you've provided for us, will clear up a lot of misconception. Again, thank you. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today. And if you have any questions, how should your constituents reach out to you, Assemblymember?
Well, the easiest way to reach out is to call my office. We're there Monday, Friday, 9 to 5. They can reach out 315-449-9536. That's my district office in Syracuse. They can always reach out to our Assembly website, and they can send us emails through the Assembly website. They can go to New York State Assembly, Google that, and look up my name, and you can send me an email, and we'll get right back to you. And it really has been an honor and privilege to represent the folks in the 128th Assembly District. It's very diverse, rural, suburban, urban in the Onondaga Nation, but we try to make sure that the policies we're bringing forward and the resources we bring back, tens of millions of dollars into the community, I've been able to bring back, hopefully is uplifting, the quality of life for the residents in the 128th Assembly District.
Thank you again. And I'll tell everyone, if you have any questions of me, you can reach me at area code 315-930-4499. Again, like, subscribe, and share. And it will say our plate is full.
All right. Vicki Brackens is the president of Brackens Financial Solutions Network, LLC, and a registered representative of LPL Financial, member SIPC. Thank you to Assemblymember Pam Hunter. And Vicki is America's money maven.